So welcome to my 2024 after primary election results video. So I'm basically doing my reaction to the initial results that we have in Washington State on our primary results, which we just had announced last night at 8 p.m. Now, unfortunately, in Washington State, as I kind of indicate with this slide right here, our results just take a while to sort out because in its infinite wisdom, Washington State's decided to go down the road of all mail-in voting, which means that we really aren't going to know the final results for a couple weeks, but you'll get a pretty good sense of where we're at based on what we saw last night and also on the next couple days when they tend to count the largest number of ballots, at least the late arriving ballots. So right now, approximately, they've counted about 1 million ballots as of the time I'm doing this video. They had about 500,000 more that are kind of sitting somewhere in the hopper, ready to be counted throughout the 39 counties of Washington State. And essentially, we just aren't going to know the final results, but so there may be some election results that change just because they're within just a few points. But essentially, I'm hoping to kind of cover most of these elections right now and give you a sense of where we're at. Now, of course, if you're in King County, perhaps you're an election worker, you might be searching for all those mystery stashes of ballots that you hid in your trunk. If you're familiar with the 2004 election, that was kind of a common theme back then. And just so that you understand how Washington State's election goes in the primary, we happen to be one of those states with a jungle primary. We're not the only one, but I did a video here a couple years ago, actually, about Washington State's top 2 jungle primary. If you don't understand how it works, I do encourage you to go to that video. I will link to it down below. It explains, though, essentially it's the top 2 vote getters in the recent election that will actually move on to the general. So you might have 30 people. It doesn't matter which party they belong to, so there's no partisan primary. What they're going to do is they're going to lump them all together, and these results just flush out. So I've got some examples coming up where you're going to have 2 Republicans potentially on the ballot, for example, and that's because of the top 2 primary. Now, before I go too much further into this, I don't want to forget to remind you to subscribe to the video channel if you haven't yet. I know a lot of people watching this video right now probably aren't subscribed to the channel, so if you could do that or like this video, do that down below. Share it widely with others if they don't know what's going on in the election process. I think the more people that get to know what's happening in Washington State, the better off we all are. And anything that helps boost our visibility really will help us quite a bit. Now, let me get to voter turnout. And this kind of chart right here I have just kind of explains roughly what we've seen in the past for the last 4 years, well, the last 4 election cycles that have a presidential race in it. And the reason why I bring that up is, rather than just saying last year's election turnout or others, is that the turnout models, as far as the percentage of people who participate in the election, tend to sync up differently on presidential years, once every 4 years when you have a presidential race coming up, as we do this year, or in between when you have these every 2-year cycle or even lower turnouts on these with just local elections, say, like we had in 2023. Right now, what we're looking at, we had about 20% were counted so far, and they say that's their voter turnout on election night, but that won't really be what it's at because we got all these late ballots coming in. So what we're really looking at is, do we exceed the really pathetic 35% roughly turnout that we had in 2016 at this point in time, or are we above 40%, which I think is kind of the number that we're going to be looking at. If we were above 50% for some miracle, if there was some miracle reason that we got there, that would actually be pretty amazing. But essentially, that's what we're looking at. Now, let me explain something real quick about one of the challenges that we have with voter turnout. And using that as a model, there is a little bit of problem with it as far as how we actually register voters in Washington State. Essentially because we use the Department of Licensing with motor voter registration. Every single state agency has the ability, if they have contact with somebody, that they register people. We have a lot of people get registered to vote now that don't ever plan on voting and won't vote under any circumstances. So we've just gone out of our way to register a lot of people. A lot of non-U.S. citizens get registered to vote in Washington State. Doesn't mean they vote, but a lot of them get registered to vote, even against their will. And we've done stories about this in the past. And so one of the things that does is it does fluff up the voter roll numbers in the state of Washington. And so there's probably a fairly decent sized number of people that have registered to vote that won't vote, and that starts to depress those voter turnout numbers. So how much that's depressed is hard to know. That you really have to get into a lot of minutia to dig into that. But I just caution you a little bit about understanding the significance of these voter turnout numbers. Now, still in the primary, we're going to be looking at these voter turnout numbers, and I'll get into that in some of these races because they do have some indication, good or bad, with the trend lines of where things are going. So let's just start top of the ballot. If you got your ballot here, let's start with the federal Senate race. And in this case, we had the Garcia versus Cantwell race. And basically, there were 11 people in this running for the federal Senate seat, but obviously only top 2 get through. Now, Maria Cantwell is the incumbent Democrat federal senator, been there a long time. She had a massive amount of money in her bank account, and really, even though there were a bunch of people that were running for the seat, the only person that actually raised any money to at least challenge her was Raul Garcia, as a Republican. And so they both advanced now to the general. Now, Cantwell ended up getting about 57% of the vote, so that generally indicates that she's in pretty good shape going into the general. It would be a long shot for Raul Garcia to beat her, but it's possible. So that's essentially what happened at the federal level. Now, if those numbers depress and she ends up getting closer down to the 54% as these final late ballots come in, maybe people look a little bit closer at that race. But generally, from a federal Senate seat, Cantwell's probably feeling fairly comfortable. Plus, she has millions and millions of dollars in the bank, and Garcia raised about $500,000 just to kind of get the show on the road here. But we'll see how it happens. And so, as kind of expected, both of them are going to be advancing to the general. So let's get into some of these other races, and essentially we're looking at congressional races that Washington State has 10 congressional representatives. And there's about 5 of the districts that are kind of worth just going through here pretty quickly. There are a couple of them that were really interesting. If you start from eastern side of Washington, so we'll start in the Spokane area, there's a 5th legislative district which was held by a long time. It's been in Republican hands since about 1994, and it basically was a surprise that suddenly you had a bunch of people jump into the race, Democrats and Republicans, and on the ballot there were actually 6 Republicans and 4 Democrats in the 5th legislative district, which you can kind of see up here. It's this furthest one covering Spokane and right next to the Idaho border. Now, essentially, and this wasn't as much a surprise, it looked like Baumgartner actually is the one who ended up being in first position when we actually looked at the final results here. There were several of the Republicans that raised money, but he'd raised the most, and he seemed to kind of be in this first position as in the way that he kind of challenged the race with really a pretty well-funded campaign. Plus, he'd been elected in Spokane, so I think that gave him an advantage over several of the other candidates who were also running on the Republican side there. Now, he's going to be facing off with a Democrat. And this was something I wasn't sure if the Democrat was going to make it through because there was a lot of contention on the Democrat side too. But essentially, you see Conroy here, and this is the 2 of them here. Both of them are basically going to be moving forward. Now, Conroy was the former the Spokane County Democrat chair. She was also involved as a consulate, assistant prosecutor. She's 3rd-generation Washingtonian, so pretty good candidate. And presented to the voters as a little bit more normal and conservative candidate than she actually is. So this is going to be the battle right over here. I think that Baumgartner's in a pretty good position to win this race, so I don't think that this is going to result in a big change back in D.C. as far as who represents the Spokane district. But it wouldn't surprise me if they threw some extra money in here just trying to challenge them. And sometimes you do get intra-Republican infighting that happens. So if there's some of the bad blood that comes out of the primary process and bleeds itself into the congressional race, then you have the potential for a bad outcome for the Republicans. But generally right now, I'd say Baumgartner probably looks pretty strong going into that race. Then you also have, moving next to the 5th Congressional District, you have the 4th Congressional District, which again goes from the Canadian border down to Oregon, and it's the second complete congressional district that's actually in eastern Washington. This was a little bit different than I think I had expected as far as an outcome to see, but it fell fairly close to what some of the surveys were indicating a while ago, and that is Jared Sessler has come out ahead. You have actually 2 Republicans in this race. So Jared Sessler, who had run 2 years ago and got bounced out in the primary, he stuck with it, kept running. He got just under 30%, which actually has placed him in first position with kind of a relatively crowded field. You had a number of Republicans, but 3 well-funded Republicans, and then you also had a number of Democrats. The Democrats went nowhere, and so what ended up happening is you have the incumbent Congressman Newhouse, who's got 24%, so 30%, 24%. So the rest of the 40 some odd percent that got split up amongst a number of other voters. Most significantly, with Tiffany Smiley, who was a Republican, also running for the seat, and incumbent Newhouse just ended up basically getting in a bitter fight with the other Republican, Tiffany Smiley. And so Sessler, who was the third well-funded Republican, or at least semi-funded Republican in that race, Sessler was able to kind of coast through while the other two were fighting each other. Now, Newhouse has a distinction of being the only Republican is still left in Congress who had voted to impeach Trump. So he has a lot of people that really don't like him in that district, and he's historically probably been the least popular Republican congressman who still actually holds that seat. They didn't retire. I mean, most of the others have retired or been defeated. And so he's the last one there, last one standing. And so this has the potential to really get a lot of outside money jumping into this race. Now, Newhouse has about $1.5 million or so in his own bank account before you look at outside political people throwing PAC money in, and I don't know if that's going to happen, but it could. And you got 2 Republicans there. So no matter what happens, there's no real impact directly on the Republican makeup in the Congress based on what happens in the 4th Congressional District. But there's still a kind of a Trump focus, which Trump's going to be behind Sessler most likely, and he's already endorsed Sessler, although there was this kind of weird dual endorsement when Smiley was running. And obviously Newhouse has done some work to basically try to, my guess is going into the general, he's going to try to get the Democrats in that district, which is about 30% of the district, to try to vote for him. So in order for Sessler to prevail in this race, he would have to overcome the Democrats who end up voting for Newhouse and the percentage of Republicans, which is relatively small, actually, who are voting for Newhouse as well. So this race is going to come down to the wire, and that's what people are going to be watching for there. I'm going to jump over to the 3rd Congressional District, which is, and this, by the way, this is Newhouse and Sessler right here. Should have had that up earlier. But so these are the 2 that'll be facing off come December or come November, and we'll see how that works. Now, I'm going to go to the 3rd Congressional District, which is my congressional district, and that's currently the Congresswoman there is Marie Gluesenkamp Perez. Now, she ended up looking at the results last night, at least as of the initial results, getting 46% of the vote, which is really not great for an incumbent. An incumbent usually wants to have in the primary be well over 50%. It makes them feel more comfortable moving forward, but her numbers were probably smaller than what she was expecting, and even a little bit smaller than what the surveys were indicating going into the race. She does have a really large fundraising advantage. Now, based on survey results, people aren't going to be too surprised that Republican Joe Kent came out with 38%, which puts him getting through the primary. And that's who's going to be facing off now. But I'm going to point out that between these 2 candidates here, Joe Kent got pretty close last time. He missed it by a few points, and that was a couple years ago. And this is going to be kind of this battle royale of all the congressional districts in America. This is actually considered one of the closest and most likely races to really come down to the wire. Republicans are anticipating a pickup, and the Democrats are going to throw just a ton of money to try to keep Gluesenkamp in there. I mean, that's going to be the inevitable race. But Joe Kent had a little bit of a disadvantage going into this election cycle because he did have a Republican, that they were splitting the vote. And this was Camas, a native Republican, Leslie Llewellyn from Camas. And but I will point out that what was interesting about this race, and I think Llewellyn did the right thing in the way that she was campaigning and that didn't get nasty infighting. And immediately afterwards, she did endorse Kent moving into the general. So you're not going to have, I don't think, as much Republican infighting this particular cycle as you saw 2 years ago when there was a lot more bitterness. Inevitably, though, I guarantee this race is just going to get a massive amount of money dumped into it because It's considered so close. It was considered a surprise win for the Democrats 2 years ago, and it will become probably one of the most expensive races in the country. I would anticipate that right now. So watch for this race. I live in the very, very north. I'm practically the last house in the 3rd Congressional District up in Thurston County. So I decided I would go to Joe Kent's party last night. It really was more of just a gathering of people. And I took a couple photos there, and I will point out a couple things here. This is if you've never gone to any of these candidate parties on election night, it just looks like this. It's just people there going to see their candidate. They get to see him in person. Usually it's a lot of volunteers that are there. And I think that it's just worthwhile to see what these things look like. I've been to many of these over the years. There were times in the past where I've tried to hit 2 or 3 in one night. This was quite a ways from my house, so I was only able to go to one event last night. But it was still kind of interesting, and I wanted to take a couple photos there so that if you've never been to one, these are really kind of an opportunity if you want to get in front of the candidates and that you support or just see what's going on. These are actually pretty good places and pretty casual places to do it. I'm going to also point out, too, this other photo right here. The candidate, in this case Joe Kent, was getting a lot of attention from the media because of the national recognition that the 3rd Congressional District has around the country as being such a close race. And so the funny thing about this was the Seattle Times reporter there was interviewing him. She just didn't even understand how the top 2 primary system worked. And so it was funny, the questions that she asked, and never presume the media knows what they're doing. If you just listen to them, they'll show that they really don't know what they're talking about. But anyway, so it was an interesting thing to just visit and see last night. Probably I would lean this district in the Republican camp, especially if they're able to avoid infighting, and we'll see where we go from there. So that brings us really then to the 8th Congressional District, which has been a very contested district and considered a very strong swing district. But the last couple years, the incumbent, Kim Schreier, has actually been able to win election pretty strongly, and she had a fairly strong showing last night. Not as strong as she probably wanted with 51%, but she does have about $3 million in her campaign bank account. What I think her challenger, the Republican Carmen Goers, who I've known for a while, she'd run for the 47th. Carmen had run for the 47th legislative district here this last cycle, and that's inside of the 8th Congressional District here in Kent. And she actually did fairly well, 44%, with very little money. I mean, she only has like $5,000 in the bank. So imagine Kim Schreier, the incumbent congresswoman, with $3 million in the bank and a $5,000 in the bank for the challenger. And there were some other people that were in the contested primary. So depending on turnout numbers, generally, this is going to be leaning to the Democrat side, but this is one of those races where if you have an unusual, strange turnout and some, stumbling on Schreier's part, and Carmen Goers is able to kind of thread the needle, you never know what could happen there. So I just wanted to point out this race because this wouldn't have been how I think they were surveying this election or for that 8th Congressional District. And then this brings me to the last interesting Congressional District to talk about here, which is the 6th. And this is out on the Olympic Peninsula. Now, what you had here was basically former state senator Drew McEwen, who is running in that district, and he's out of the kind of Mason County area, and he got 30%, which essentially gets him through the top 2 primary. But if you really add in some of these other challengers, he's going to be up in that 41% range right now, which doesn't look super strong. But the big battle that occurred in the primary here were between the 2 Democrats. And the Democrat that prevailed was Emily Randall. And she is considered the more extreme of the Democrats that was running, but she was running against Hillary Franz, who's currently the Public Lands Commissioner. And Hillary Franz just squandered her opportunity to probably prevail, at least to become the Democrat candidate going to the general and the congressional race, just because she had a ton of money in the bank. She actually outspent Randall and then just squandered it, but she also left like $250,000 in her bank account, or at least it looks like that on the FEC report. Maybe we'll see the next results will indicate she actually did spend that, but it was just weird. She just got destroyed despite having this money advantage. And so it's going to be a face-off now between Randall, who just went through a really bruising battle on the Democrat side for this congressional seat to be that candidate, and then the Republican, Drew McEwen, who's going to come through with very little money. It's kind of a long shot race, I think, based on the approach that they've taken here so far. But it's still one of those races where the Republicans do have a legitimate candidate running, and the Democrats have kind of a crazy person running for Congress. So it's going to be interesting to see what actually happens. Now, you got these 5 remaining congressional races after this, but that are also going to be on the ballot. And there is at least one Republican on the ballot in each one of those races. That's a good thing. But none of those races are considered that close or likely to have a Republican prevail. And I just want to base that on just reality, the surveys and numbers, the money in the bank, and the type of campaigns that are being run. But it's a good thing in the sense that you didn't get 2 Democrats through, which the Republicans have done historically in the past. And if you looked at how the Republican state party, Jim Walsh, actually put out a statement that said that was one of their goals, of course, was to avoid having 2 Democrats in any of these big races. And it looks like they were able to avoid that for the most part, looking at the way it's happened right now. So they would consider the endorsement process at the convention probably to be mostly successful, not completely. And now let's jump into some of the other races that everybody wants to know about, and that is the governor race. And this is, of course, the top of the ticket statewide race. I do have some basic observations here that are worth going over. Reichert is the Republican who's going to make it through, and that fits kind of what the surveys were showing. He got 28% of the vote. Mullet, who had just under 6% of the vote. Byrd, who really kind of underperformed, I think, at the 9% of the vote. Mullet, in a way, and I've talked about this, guys, in a number of other videos in the past. Mullet was a Democrat, but he's run on the anti-Ferguson platform, and he actually got a little bit better than I would have expected at 6%. But Ferguson, and look, I made a mistake. This is actually what Ferguson looks like right here. Sorry about that, a little Freudian slip. Anyway, Ferguson actually came out a lot weaker than expected, with 45% of the vote, which is not what you want if you're the lead candidate trying to get on the ballot. It means that you're weak. If you add up all the people who were anti-Ferguson, Ferguson's in trouble. Now, big things change, lots of money. Ferguson has a ton of money. He has more money than Reichert, for sure. But it nevertheless means that he may have to send a lot more of those tuna chicken checks out there and really work to bribe a lot more voters and pretend like he actually cares about public safety. Just as a little side note, I've noticed that as Ferguson's been going around to Chamber of Commerce meetings, he refuses to take any questions unless they're basically questions from a friend in the audience, because he sure doesn't really want to talk about his record, which is terrible and abysmal in the AG's office. So it's an interesting approach he's got. It's not a basement strategy, but it's certainly a ask no questions and let me talk about nothing strategy, and we'll see how it goes. Now, one of the things to discuss here on just the basic voter turnout, there were a couple of seats that are worth looking at, the races at the statewide level, because they indicate the actual just generic partisan sort of turnout that occurred during the primary. And basically the state treasurer race and the state auditor race are the two I would look at here. Now, Pellicati is the Democrat incumbent. He got 58% of the vote. Sharon Hannock, who's challenging him, got 41% of the vote. Sharon has run for this office before, back in 2012. I've known Sharon a long, long time. But what this generally indicates is that for races that are kind of down ticket, not a lot of attention is spent on them, and the state treasurer qualifies as one of these. And there's not a lot of money being spent. It's hard for the campaign, the people running them for the campaign positions. They may be traveling around the state going to events, but there's just not a lot of attention spent. And so when the voters get their ballot, this kind of indicates the percentage of just partisan voters that were participating, roughly. It's a kind of like a big survey, really, using the election that way. Nobody else was it wasn't like a primary with 5 or 6 people. You had 2 people. And the state auditor race also showed a similar makeup, where incumbent McCarthy got 59% of the vote and challenger Republican Hawkins out of Spokane got 41%. So between these two races, that gives you a sense that based on the turnout models, at least as of election night, and we'll see where this goes as all these late ballots get counted, but I would anticipate that if this turnout model for these two races shifts somewhere into closer to the mid-40s, it'll give us a better sense of partisan turnout and enthusiasm, at least at the primary election level. So that's why those two races are interesting. Again, these aren't races that get a lot of attention, and there's not a lot of money behind them. And so they're kind of like just a placeholder to some extent in the way that it indicates it. Now, I'm not trying to insult the candidates, but I'm just saying you got two incumbents being challenged by Republicans, and with just an R and a D on the ballot, that number that they get generally indicates what you're looking at. Now, for a more contentious and kind of brutal race you have going on, the state attorney general's race was an interesting one. Pete Serrano essentially got the first position coming out of the primary with 42% of the vote, and Nick Brown, as kind of expected, got 35% of the vote. So these are the two guys that are going to end up on the general election in November. Moncadingra, who was the other Democrat that was running in the primary, just got destroyed at 22% of the vote. I think she really was too extreme even for the Democrats. But this is an important race. And you see Serrano again there with about slightly higher than what the normal percentage would be if you're looking at the other two races we just talked about. So he's 42% or so. What he's going to have to do now in the general is he's going to have to step up his game and get a lot more support to get that word out on why he's a better candidate than Brown. But the good news for people, I think, in Washington State is that Moncadingra is considered just too crazy to be allowed to get on the general election. Now, if you want to know more about this, I did do a video. It's linked down below. You can see the thumbnail here about this race, but I think it's an important race. Now, the Public Lands Commissioner race. This is an unusual surprise, at least at this point in time, because this is one of those races where there's a possibility that you may get just two Republicans to come through on the final ballot. And this is because the Democrats split their vote up amongst a number of candidates. Now, at this point in time, as of the time I'm doing this video, Jamie Herrera Butler leads the field with 22.6% of the vote. She's a former Congresswoman, my former Congresswoman from the 3rd Congressional District. She had held that seat from 2010 until 2 years ago. And she running for the Public Lands Commissioner, this was actually a pretty good showing. The Republican Party endorsed Sue Cale Peterson, who's also made it through. Sue had 20.2% of the vote. And this was enough of them to actually, both of them, two Republicans right now, leading the field in Washington State's top two primary. If that continues, if that holds, then you will have two Republicans on the ballot, which means the Republicans will finally be able to get back into Public Lands Commissioner and try to clean up the disaster that the basic Democrats that have kind of occupied that seat have turned that place into over the last few years. However, I will point out, though, that Sue Cale Peterson only leads the Democrat Up the Grove by about 4,000 votes. That's not a lot. And right now you see a picture of Up the Grove here. He's a King County councilman, actually, who's running, and his future plans for the forests are in the background here. His plans really are not good for our natural resources and historically results in a large volume of our natural resources just burning up with their horrible forest management policies. I'll point out there was another Democrat in the race, and that actually took some of the votes away from Up the Grove, and his name was Van de Weg. He'd been in the legislature, and he actually had a pretty rational and logical approach to forest management, very similar, actually, to the Republicans in the race. But he only could get 4.5%, 5% of the vote, give or take. We'll see what the final numbers are. And it seems that anybody voting for him would be more interested in voting for one of the Republicans than they would for Up the Grove. We'll just have to see what these final numbers come through and whether Up the Grove is able to get through the race. I will point out one more thing on the background is that Up the Grove running for city council or for the King County Council was challenged by a leftist recently, and he survived that only because the Republicans in that district crossed over to vote for him because as left-leaning as he was considered not crazy enough for King County. And so now shifting into this race for Public Lands Commissioner, it's a very unusual direction for him to take, sort of, but it's an opportunity if the two Republicans can stand there that we'll definitely have a Republican in their statewide office. To some extent, this is like a 2016 redo when the Republicans won the state treasurer race in a similar type of scenario where two Republicans made it to the general. Now, in a nonpartisan race, let's talk about the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction. Basically, this is the position that manages schools. Incumbent Chris Reichtel did the worst of any statewide incumbent Democrat, and he got 39% of the vote, which is horrible for him, actually. And Olson, who's generally been considered a much more significant person who actually believes in math. He has the ability to define what a woman is. He believes in rigor in the classroom. He just generally believes in real education, which is a big contrast between him and Reichel. And Olson, who's currently a school board member out in the Olympic School District out on the peninsula, he got 31% of the vote. So the two of them actually aren't that far off. Now, from kind of the Democrat side of or at least let's call it the progressive-ish side of the educational establishment, Reichel had actually been challenged by a guy named Saras, who got 23% of the vote, which was really good. And he and Reichel were the two that were really confronting each other and essentially split a lot of the vote. And that's really what helped Reichel get taken down quite a bit, because the two of them were just going at each other. And Saras had a lot of money. But this is another example of somebody coming in with a lot of money and then squandering most of their campaign funds on consultants. I mean, essentially, the Saras campaign was an excellent example of how to waste most of your money on stupid consultants. And whatever value they brought, it wasn't enough to do voter outreach or improve things. I do have to admire him for his willingness to go aggressively at Reichel. That's unusual to see that on the left side of the political spectrum. And I did appreciate the fact that he believed that Reichel's clear and obvious track record of destroying public education was probably not a good thing. This is an opportunity for Olson, if he can capitalize on this, especially working Eastern King County, the North Shore School District, places where the parents there generally still believe in math, rigor, high cap programs, things like that, and they're pretty angry about it. They have an opportunity, I think, to make a big impact if he goes out there and works it. I did a video about this race a little while ago. I'll link to that down below too. There's a general move to try, general recognition among anybody who's paid any attention that Reichel's been the worst thing that's ever happened to the public school students in this state. And other than the fact that he's chased 41,000 of them out of the school system into private school or homeschooling. And so there's some recognition that there's an opportunity to do a pickup here, and Olson would be certainly a good choice. Moving on to the insurance commissioner. This is another position that people forget about, probably largely because the former incumbent there had become fossilized in that position for 20 years. So Kreidler had been there forever. And the two candidates that came out of the scrum of the primary last night, and clearly leading in both cases, Kuderer represented the Democrats with 44% of the vote so far, and Fortunato, a state senator from the 31st district, with 28% of the vote. And they are the two that are going to be in the general election. Now, here's the thing that I've thought about before in this race, and I want to bring it up again. This is a race that Fortunato could win. I mean, there were other Democrats in the race, and usually the rule of thumb is to add all the Democrat votes and add all the Republican votes together. But this is one of those brand sort of positions that nobody's paying attention to, but everybody's paying attention to the fact that they're paying a lot more in insurance directly as a result of the incompetence, not completely, but it's partly a result of incompetence in the insurance commissioner's office and a complete lack of concern for the harm being done to consumers in Washington state by the policies that have been implemented. Kuderer is obsessed only with single-payer health care, which is really blinders on to all the other problems that exist in the insurance world in Washington state that this office could have some influence on, at least reducing the cost of living, which Kuderer doesn't seem to care about at all. And so I do think this is an opportunity that Fortunato kind of focused on consumer advocacy quite a bit. Kuderer just seems to be stuck in this obscure world of single-payer insurance only, and that's not going to help the most people. This is an opportunity. It's actually a potential for Fortunato, who's kind of eccentric at times himself. He would have the ability to campaign and get out of this and win, which would be just a huge improvement, I think, in that office. Now, I had not really talked too much yet about the Supreme Court position. One of them, several are up on the ballot this year, but one of them had enough people that they had to have a primary, and there were 4 people running for position 2. And now we're down to the final 2 finalists as of last night. It looks for sure that Federal Way Judge Dave Larson, who I'm a pretty big fan of, came out with 37%, and his challenger is, and again, this is a nonpartisan race, is Sal Munguia. Gia, actually. He's out of Pierce County. And between the two of them, Larson is definitely a superior choice. If we got Larson on the Supreme Court of Washington State, it would really make an impact because we'd have somebody in there that believes that the Constitution's real, that it means what it says, and he actually has some judicial experience going into it, which Sal definitely doesn't. So it would actually be an improvement for Washington State if we got him in there, and it's kind of a big deal. Now, there's two more races I'm going to talk about that were statewide races, just briefly. One is the Secretary of State race. Hobbs is the incumbent. He had 49% of the vote. The Republican challenger and endorsed candidate, Whitaker, got 36%. The other people in that race were Dems. Whitaker doesn't have a lot of money. Hobbs is generally considered a front runner in this race for sure, and probably a comfortable front runner, so we'll just have to see where it goes. But that's how it came through, as kind of expected looking at this race. The other one that we didn't know how it was going to go for sure was for the lieutenant governor race. Now, on one hand, you had Denny Huck, long-term incumbent in this position, but also really he's been in the political world in Washington State since the 70s, and he'd recently been in Congress in the 10th Congressional District for quite a few years. Denny Huck got 48.6% of the vote, which is surprisingly weak, actually, considering his background and his funding. And the Republican Matthews came out with 22.5%. Now, there were several Republicans that split the vote in this race, so this is a little bit better than normal chance of a Republican maybe posting a decent position or decent result in the lieutenant governor race, far better than what Republicans have done in the past when they flooded the zone and made sure that only 2 Democrats made it to the primary. So at least from that perspective, this was an improvement. But Matthews doesn't have a lot of money right now, and so we'll just have to see how this race plays out. Lieutenant governor, again, is one of those places that people don't pay a lot of attention to. One of the challenges Matthews will have here is that Denny Huck has the ability to raise a lot of money. He historically has, and so we'll see where it goes from there. Now, I don't have enough time yet to really completely talk about and not at least at this video, and I want to wait for some more results to come in, but to talk about the Washington State Legislature results around the state. But I am kind of leading this video. I want to leave you with a couple thoughts on what happened and where we're going from here, because I want to wait for more results to come in and do another video next week on this. There are 49 districts in Washington State. Maybe there's 5 or 6 at the most that appear competitive this cycle. A handful of these races have, surprisingly actually, top 2 Republicans look like they're coming through in several different districts. So the districts that we're going to be talking about essentially are going to be some of these districts like here. I've just marked them 42nd, 10th, 2nd, 39th, the 18th probably. There's a number of these districts that are worth looking at and looking at the results, but some of the races are still a little close. Again, there's a lot more ballots still coming in. And we'll be talking about the makeup of the state legislature and how this election cycle could have an impact. I think there are roughly 3 takeaways right now in just an overall review of how things have gone for the state legislative races. Essentially, from a Republican perspective, and from a liberty freedom angle, what the Republicans want to do is retain the number of Senate seats they currently have, possibly pick up one more. There is a discussion, I'll have this next week when I do this video, about one of the seats, or if you log on to the live stream, you'll probably hear me talk about this as well, about a couple of positions where they have the potential to pick up maybe one seat. But to hold or pick up, that's essentially what they're looking at. When it comes to the House side of things, I really think the Republicans are well positioned to pick up a handful of state House seats. I never doubt the ability to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, but there are some opportunities the Republicans have that the numbers in this primary would indicate, and the candidates running and just the makeup of what's going on right now. It looks like they have the ability to pick up a couple seats, which would be good for us in the state legislature. However, there's one thing that I have to caution. I'll go into more detail on this later, but the Republicans are going to desperately need to avoid wasting their cash on stupid Republican versus Republican races in the 39th and the 2nd specifically. And this is what I mean by that. Listen, you got 2 Republicans that are going on into the general. That's great. There is no impact, regardless of who wins in those 2 races, on makeup in the legislature, and that's just a fact. But you do have preferences, of course, that Republican leadership will have as to who who wins. And the temptation is, because most Republican consultants are terrible at actually fighting against Democrats. Most of them don't even know how to do that. But they're really comfortable. Their safe space is to fight against each other. And so a lot of the consultants are going to want to fight each other in these Republican-on-Republican races and squander a lot of money from the Reagan Fund or from other funds into those types of races rather than divert the vast majority, and I say vast majority, I'm talking 98% of it, into the races where you actually have opportunities to either defend a Republican seat from a Democrat or take one from a Democrat. I don't know why the Republicans don't seem to think that way, but it would be helpful if they do this year because we have the opportunity, I think, to actually, at least looking at where things are now, to pick up some seats and to make some headway, which we desperately need in Washington State. Now, here's the reality. November's coming, right? The election's coming up not that long from now. Turnout is inevitably going to be higher, like it always is, especially with the presidential race. It's going to be very high, I would anticipate, this year. The other thing that affects us in Washington State is the fact that we have these 4 initiatives, the Vote Yes, Pay Less program, that are going to be on the ballot. Plus, if you live in Whatcom, there's going to be another initiative to repeal a property tax. Generally, for normal people and people who care about their cost of living and aren't tied into the big government complex, they're going to want to reduce their cost of living. Vote Yes, Pay Less makes sense. It's going to drive a lot of otherwise apathetic people to come out and vote, even if they don't like the politicians. That might drive them to vote, and many of those people are going to vote more towards the liberty freedom side than the crazy socialist side of things. But as always, what we have to look for going into November is the only way to make an impact is to show up, because in the end, the future belongs to those who show up.